3 years of invisibility. That's what Ashley Cooper had perfected at Sacred Heart's cardiac unit in Houston, the art of moving through fluorescent-lit corridors without leaving an impression, speaking only when spoken to, volunteering for the night shifts that made other nurses flinch. She had become the kind of person people looked through, not at. The kind of person whose name nobody remembered by Friday. The thing about invisibility is that it requires perfect execution. No eye contact that lasted more than 2 seconds. No opinions offered in break rooms. No stories about where she'd been before nursing school, before Houston, before the 3-year gap in her resume that she'd learned to deflect with a tired smile and a question about someone else's weekend. She'd built a life on saying nothing. On being no one. On the understanding that the moment anyone looked too closely, the entire construction would collapse. That night in October, Ashley clocked in at 10:02 p.m. The ER was a controlled chaos, a drunk driver in Bay 3 with a compound fracture, an elderly man with chest pain in Bay 7, a young motorcycle accident victim headed to trauma. Her hands moved without thought as she prepped medications and checked monitors, muscle memory so ingrained that her body knew what to do before her mind caught up. Antiseptic burned her nostrils. Fluorescent lights hummed their constant electric song above her head. The ventilator in Bay 4 wheezed its rhythmic mechanical breath, and Ashley moved between them all like a shadow, necessary and unremarkable. Around 2:17 a.m., Dr. Marcus Hargrove arrived on the unit. He was the kind of man whose presence announced itself, tailored white coat, Rolex that caught the light, the confidence of someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. His reputation preceded him, board connections, legacy admissions, the kind of doctor who built his career on knowing the right people rather than being the best at what he did. He moved through Sacred Heart like he owned the title to the building. The trauma patient in Bay 1 was deteriorating. 34-year-old construction worker, crushed chest from a forklift accident 20 minutes ago, and the CT confirmed what everyone could feel in the room, pneumothorax. The lungs were collapsing, oxygen saturation dropping like a stone. The attending physician was ordering a chest tube insertion, but his hands weren't quite steady. Too much adrenaline. Too much pressure. Ashley had the equipment ready before he asked. Antiseptic swab. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Sterile drape. The kind of preparedness that came from muscle memory, from a time in her life she no longer acknowledged. Dr. Hargrove stood at the patient's bedside, watching. Observing. His jaw tightened slightly as he noted the way Ashley moved, no wasted motion, every step precise, hand steady as a surgical laser despite the chaos around them. The attending physician struggled with the needle angle. Ashley could see it immediately. She didn't say anything. She just stepped closer and adjusted his hand position with a gentle touch to his wrist. 2 millimeters to the right. Higher on the ribs. The needle found the intercostal space on the second attempt, and the hiss of air escaping from the pneumothorax filled the room like a held breath being released. Sinus rhythm. The patient's oxygen saturation climbed immediately. 68, 72. 79, the monitor began its steady beeping again. Good assist, the attending physician muttered, but he was already moving to the next task. Hargrove's eyes had narrowed. Ashley felt his gaze before she saw it, the kind of attention that made the back of her neck tighten. He was watching the way she'd moved during the procedure, the economy of motion, the clinical certainty. She'd forgotten to hide that part of herself. She'd let the training show through. It was a mistake. 3 minutes later, Ashley was restocking the trauma bay when a voice interrupted the fluorescent hum. It wasn't loud. Just a question spoken low, meant only for her ears. You worked forward operating bases, didn't you? The words hit her like a physical thing. She turned slowly. The voice belonged to a visiting combat medic, a lean man with the kind of weathered face that came from desert deployments, with eyes the color of storm clouds. He'd been observing the trauma response, assessing techniques, the way military medical personnel do when they're evaluating capability. Ashley met his eyes. She took one measured breath. Not the rapid breath of panic. Not the controlled breath of fear. The kind of breath a person takes when they're making a decision that costs something. One tear escaped. Just one. She didn't blink. She didn't look away. She reached up and wiped it with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact. "You're mistaken," she said. Her voice was quiet. Steady. The voice of someone speaking the truth and something else simultaneously. She turned and walked out of the trauma bay with her spine straight. Past the medication cart. Past the nurse's station. Into the hallway where the fluorescent lights buzzed their electronic song and nobody was watching. But that wasn't the last moment of that night. That came later, after her shift ended at 6:33 a.m., after she'd driven through Houston's pre-dawn darkness to Glenwood Cemetery on the city's west side. Ashley knelt in the rain at grave marker for 47B, the stone cold under her forehead. The rain hammered down like applause nobody wanted, soaking through her jacket, mixing with something else on her face. "I tried," she whispered to the headstone. To the name engraved there. To the man buried beneath 3 feet of Texas soil. "I tried to disappear like you asked. Tried to be normal. Tried to be just a nurse." The rain continued its assault. Her voice broke just barely. "But I failed at that too." Back at Sacred Heart, Dr. Hargrove was in his office, Ashley's personnel file open on his desk. His finger stopped on the employment history section. 3 years at Sacred Heart. Before that, a 3-year gap. No explanation. No jobs listed. No reason given. His jaw clenched as he flipped through the rest of the paperwork. Every performance review glowing. Every assessment noting unusual competence with trauma cases. Every notation flagged as unusual for night shift RN. He closed the file. His eyes were very narrow. Something had shifted in the way he was looking at her, the way an animal looks at prey once it understands the prey might be more than it appeared. The medication discrepancy notice appeared on the public unit board at 7:04 a.m., right as the night shift was turning over to day staff. Red marker. Ashley Cooper's name printed in capital letters. Beneath it, in Hargrove's precise handwriting, remedial training required, basic documentation protocols. 12 people saw it before Ashley did. 12 people watched the night nurse approach the board with her coffee, still moving in that smooth, economical way of hers, and freeze for exactly 2 seconds as she read her name displayed like a failure. Hargrove stood nearby, speaking to the day shift supervisor, his voice pitched to carry. "Nurse Cooper has been with us 3 years, he was saying, but apparently the fundamentals of charting still require some reinforcement." He didn't look at Ashley. That was the technique, speak about her as if she weren't there. As if she were equipment with a malfunction. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Ashley took one measured breath. Her right hand held the coffee cup steady. Her left hand, the one that still carried muscle memory from things she didn't talk about, remained still at her side. One tear escaped. Just one. She didn't blink. Didn't look away from Hargrove's face. She reached up and wiped it with the back of her hand, never breaking eye contact, and when her voice came out it was steady as a laser. "The discrepancy was your residence, doctor. The chart is time-stamped." She set her coffee cup down on the counter with deliberate care, turned, and walked toward the cardiac unit. Her spine was straight. Her shoulders didn't hunch. Behind her, she could feel the weight of 12 pairs of eyes and the suffocating silence that meant everyone understood exactly what had just happened. They were watching a small woman accept public humiliation without flinching. That was what Hargrove wanted them to see. What they didn't understand, what he didn't understand, was that Ashley had stood in forward operating bases under fire. She had held a bleeding lieutenant while medevac rotor wash tore at her scrubs. She had stared at a Taliban commander's face across 10 meters of dust and made the choice that saved her team. A red marker on a bulletin board was not humiliation. It was just noise. But Hargrove hadn't gotten where he was by making small moves. 3 days later, Ashley entered the break room during her lunch shift. 5 senior nurses sat in the corner with their coffee, Morrison, Chen, Valdez, the two Jennifers. They'd been friendly enough before. Professional. Cordial. The moment Ashley sat down with her sandwich, Morrison gathered her cup. Meeting, she said, though there was no meeting. Chen followed. Then Valdez. Then both Jennifers, who exchanged a glance that meant they'd been waiting for permission. Within 20 seconds, Ashley was alone at the table with her sandwich and the sound of the refrigerator compressor humming in the background. She ate slowly. Her hands were steady. The sandwich tasted like cardboard and something bitter she couldn't name. Her left-hand tremor returned, just a small flutter in her fingers, something she thought she'd trained out of herself years ago. Nerve damage or trauma response, the VA neurologist had said. It would always be there, waiting for stress to activate it. She pressed her left hand flat against the table and held it there while she chewed. The next day, same thing. The day after, same thing again. By the end of the week, Ashley wasn't even bothering to try the break room. She ate in her car or in the supply closet with the door closed, standing up, eating quickly, getting back to her patients. Isolation was a tactic. Hargrove was good at isolation. Lieutenant Marcus Webb was admitted to the cardiac unit on a Tuesday morning with arrhythmia that the ER couldn't explain. 41 years old, built like someone who'd spent decades running combat operations. His wife held his hand. Their daughter, maybe 12, sat in the corner chair looking terrified in the way children do when they don't have enough information to understand what's happening. Ashley was doing a full cardiovascular assessment, palpating his radial pulse, listening to his carotid arteries for brutes, moving with the practiced efficiency she'd learned in places she didn't think about anymore, when Hargrove entered without knocking. "Mrs. Webb," he said, his voice like honey over broken glass, "I apologize that Nurse Cooper was assigned to your husband's care. She has very limited experience with trauma cases. Her background is quite unremarkable. I'll be supervising personally to ensure proper care." The wife's face shifted. Fear became doubt. That was what Hargrove was doing, transferring doubt like an infection, spreading it through the family so they'd lose confidence in Ashley's hands, which were the best hands in this hospital. Ashley's jaw tightened. Her shoulders stayed level. She took one measured breath, and when she spoke, her voice was a flat, polite line. "I'll get the lieutenant's medication now." She walked out of the room with her spine straight, and in the hallway she could feel the weight of someone's attention. A man in tactical medic's patches, Torres, according to his badge, stood near the nurse's station, and his eyes tracked her the way a predator tracks movement. Like something in him recognized something in her. She didn't look back. Torres was still there over the next 2 shifts. He'd entered the system as a consultant. The hospital occasionally brought in military medical specialists to review trauma protocols. He moved through the cardiac unit with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst, and his eyes followed Ashley everywhere. When she moved, he watched. When she accessed the medication dispenser, he noted the speed of her hands. When she set up a new EKG machine, his attention locked onto her posture, the angle of her shoulders, the way her feet were positioned for balance. At 3:56 a.m. on the 3rd night, the trauma page came through. GSW transfer, multiple wounds, tension pneumothorax. Gang violence, 3 blocks from the hospital. The patient was already in the trauma bay when Ashley arrived, and her body recognized what needed to happen before her brain finished processing the scene. Tension pneumothorax meant collapsed lung. Meant pressure building in the chest cavity with nowhere to go. Meant the patient was heading toward cardiac arrest if the pressure wasn't relieved in the next few minutes. She didn't think. Thinking was a luxury in forward operating bases, and her hands moved like they always had, reaching for the Kelly clamps, for the prep kit, positioning herself at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The exact location. The exact angle. She prepped the chest with surgical speed, her body angled exactly as she'd been trained to angle it, and under her breath, without meaning to, she started counting in the cadence they'd used in Marjah. 1, 2, 3. Needle decompression. 4, 5, 6. Air escaping with a low hiss. She inserted the needle with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory so deep it bypasses consciousness entirely. The air came out of the patient's chest in a thin whistle, the kind of sound that meant pressure releasing, meant survival, meant she'd gotten it right in the 47 seconds before it would have been too late. Torres watched from the trauma bay doorway, and something shifted in his face. Recognition. Not suspicion. Recognition. She was cleaning up the equipment when he approached, his voice quiet like a question. "You worked forward operating bases, didn't you?" Ashley met his eyes. She'd known this moment would come eventually, that someone who'd actually been there would eventually see her the way she really was. One measured breath. The kind of breath you take before you jump, before you fall, before you make a choice you can't take back. A single tear escaped from her right eye. She wiped it without looking away from his face, and when she spoke, her voice was steady as a surgical laser. "You're mistaken." She turned and walked out, and behind her Torres stood very still, understanding dawning across his face like comprehension of something he couldn't quite prove but couldn't quite deny either. The next morning, Hargrove intercepted Torres in the physician parking lot, where the Houston heat was already rising off the asphalt like a visible thing. His voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of a man accustomed to being believed. "I understand you may have had some observations about Nurse Cooper's techniques," he said. Torres didn't respond, just watched him with the patience of someone trained to listen. "She has a tendency toward overconfidence. If you're concerned about proper protocols being followed, I'd appreciate you bringing those concerns to me directly. Patient safety is my primary concern, as I'm sure it's yours." Torres nodded slowly, but he didn't agree. Something in his military experience recognized a territorial display when he saw one. Meanwhile, in the cardiac unit, Lieutenant Webb's monitor was showing increasing irregularity. His heart rhythm was becoming more chaotic, less predictable. The arrhythmia was worsening, which meant the underlying problem, whatever was causing his heart to misbehave, was progressing. Ashley noted it in his chart. Flagged it for Hargrove. Left a message on his voicemail at 11:34 p.m. No response. At 1:38 a.m., Webb's monitor alarmed. Not a single isolated beat, a sustained run of ventricular tachycardia, a rhythm that was incompatible with consciousness, incompatible with blood flow, incompatible with living much longer without intervention. Ashley was already running toward his room. The monitor screamed once, then settled into a rhythm that wasn't a rhythm at all, just chaos translated into electrical impulses, a heart in the grip of something that wasn't quite a beat anymore. Ashley was already moving before the second alarm fired, her legs carrying her down the corridor like muscle memory taking the wheel, and the fluorescent lights above blurred into a white tunnel leading toward trauma. The GSW transfer had come in at 2:33 a.m. from a parking lot behind a convenience store in the 3rd Ward, 23-year-old male with 2 entrance wounds and a tension pneumothorax that had been slowly suffocating him for 40 minutes before the ambulance even arrived. The ER had been chaos, nurses hunting for equipment, the resident calling for a trauma surgeon who was already scrubbed in on a motor vehicle collision 3 floors up, the trauma bay smelling like blood and antiseptic, and the particular electric fear that came when the math wasn't working in anyone's favor. Ashley had moved through it without a word, her hands finding the right needle gauge, 14-gauge angiocath, and the right spot, the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, and when she'd pressed in, the hiss of air escaping had been loud enough that everyone in the room had gone still for exactly 1 second. The kid's oxygen saturation had started climbing immediately. 78, 85. 92, his gasping had stopped. His eyes had focused for the first time since arrival. That was 90 minutes ago. That kid was stable now, sedated, prepped for the OR, already written up in Hargrove's incident report as inappropriate interventions by nursing staff requiring physician oversight. The medication discrepancy notation had appeared in her personnel file within 2 hours, printed and posted on the unit board where everyone could see it, her name and the date, and the phrase requires recertification on controlled substance documentation. It was the second humiliation. There had been 3 others, each one carefully surgical in its placement, each one designed to widen the gap between Ashley and anyone who might otherwise have defended her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part had already arrived in a bed marked with a Navy SEAL patient tag and a pressure reading that had been normal at 11 p.m. and was now circling the drain like bathwater in a sinking ship. The room was dim when she pushed through the doors. Lieutenant Webb lay on his back, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles of his neck stood out like cables under canvas, and his breathing, when he was breathing, was coming in short, shallow gasps that suggested his lungs were competing with something else for space inside his chest. The monitor beside his bed showed what she already knew: blood pressure 80/40 and dropping, heart rate 128, oxygen saturation 89% despite the high-flow mask sitting crooked on his face. His lips had started to take on the pale blue tint of someone whose heart was beating but not pumping, whose body was running on vapors and will. "Webb," she said, and his eyes found hers immediately, the eyes of a man who'd spent his life reading small signals in life-or-death situations, who recognized the particular quality of stillness that came right before action. She checked the lines, the monitors, the medications already running, and the math clicked into place with terrible clarity. The pericardial sac, the membrane surrounding his heart, had been filling with blood for hours, slowly, the pressure building like a vice closing around the one muscle that couldn't afford to be squeezed. Tamponade. Cardiac tamponade. The kind of emergency that killed people not because their heart stopped working, but because they literally couldn't beat anymore. She moved to the phone and paged Hargrove. Code 99. Stat. Then she paged cardiothoracic and marked it urgent, her voice calm and level as she rattled off the vital signs, the presentation, the time since Webb's last stable reading. The operator acknowledged. Line for the attending to call back was open. Everything was in motion. Everything was waiting. The phone rang back 17 seconds later. Hargrove's voice came through thick with sleep fury, the tone of a man being dragged away from something important. "What's the situation?" Ashley kept her voice clipped, professional, every word exactly the information he needed and no more. Chest tube still patent. Lung expansion adequate. Current BP 76/38 and declining. Heart rate now 134. She's thinking tamponade. She needs permission to insert a central line and prepare for pericardiocentesis. Pericardiocentesis, Hargrove said, and she heard the hesitation in his voice, the moment where a doctor realized he was being asked to authorize something that could kill the patient if it went wrong, or kill the patient if he refused. "Do not proceed." "That's a direct order, Nurse Cooper." "You will wait for the attending." "Cardiothoracic will be there in," she heard him checking something. 15 minutes. "You will maintain current protocols and stand by." "Acknowledge." Blood pressure 72/35. The monitor beeped again, and this time it was a slower beep, the rhythm deteriorating now, Webb's heart not even pretending anymore that it was getting sufficient blood volume to pump. She watched his eyes glaze slightly, watched his breathing slow, not because he was calming down, but because his brain was starting to starve. "I acknowledge," Ashley said, and then she hung up the phone. She didn't shout it. She didn't slam it. She simply ended the call and turned to the equipment cart where everything she would need was already arrayed in meticulous order: the ultrasound probe, the sterile drapes, the pericardiocentesis needle, 18 gauge, long enough to reach the pericardial sac, sharp enough to do it cleanly. The antiseptic was there. The syringe was there. Everything except permission, and permission, she'd learned in Marjah and every combat zone between there and here, was a luxury you often couldn't afford. She was prepping the ultrasound when Torres appeared in the doorway, still wearing the blue consult jacket, a tablet in his hands that he'd clearly been reviewing when something had pulled his attention here instead. His eyes went from Webb's monitor to her hands, and something in his expression shifted, recognition mixed with something that might have been respect or might have been horror or might have been both at once. "You're going to need an assist," he said. Not a question. Ashley looked at him. Looked at his hands, steady and scarred. Looked at the way he'd moved through the doorway like someone who'd done field medicine in tight quarters before. "2 hands or 3, she asked. "However many you need," Torres said, and he stepped into the room. She didn't ask where he'd learned. Some answers weren't meant for questions. She simply nodded and pulled a second pair of gloves from the box, moving with the precision of muscle memory that had nothing to do with civilian medical training. The ultrasound showed exactly what she'd expected. The pericardial sac distended like a balloon, filled with blood that should have been nowhere near the heart, pressing down on the ventricles with a weight of fluid physics that didn't care about protocol or hierarchy, or Hargrove's voice still echoing in her head. Ashley prepped the needle entry point just below the xiphoid process, feeling for the angle, and Torres moved beside her without being told, his hand steadying Webb's chest wall, his eyes on the monitor. The needle went in with practiced smoothness, not rushed, not hesitant, just perfectly calibrated pressure applied at exactly the right angle. Ashley angled it up and toward the left shoulder, guided by the ultrasound image, feeling through the needle for the moment when it would breach the pericardium and enter the sac. The slight give of tissue. The angle adjusted by maybe 2 millimeters. The needle advanced. Dark blood filled the syringe like tears filling a reservoir. 60 milliliters came out before the pressure eased enough that blood was no longer flowing into the needle. On the monitor, Webb's pressure began its climb, 75/40. 85/50. 95/60. His eyes cleared. His breathing deepened. The blue tint in his lips started to fade as his heart, no longer being strangled, could actually do the job it was built for. Torres was staring at her hands. His jaw was tight enough to break teeth. "Don't," Ashley said quietly, her voice absolutely level. She disposed of the needle, the syringe, the evidence of what she'd just done without authorization. "Whoever you think you're looking at right now. That's not the answer." "Where did you serve?" he asked, and there was something in his voice like a man asking a question he'd been holding since 3 a.m. when she'd moved like a battlefield medic saving a kid's life in the 3rd ward. Ashley finished her charting. Documented the procedure, the vitals, the intervention. Perfect documentation that would either save her or nail her clothes depending on which way the next few hours broke. She didn't look up at him. "I'm going on break," she said, and she walked out of the room with her spine straight and her hands absolutely steady. She was in the break room drinking coffee that tasted like machine oil and regret when Hargrove arrived 23 minutes later. She heard him first, the sharp bark of his voice coming down the corridor, the way his shoes hit the tile floor with the rhythm of someone who was angry, and then the moment when all of that stopped because he walked into Webb's room and understood exactly what had happened. She didn't follow him. She didn't need to see his face. She already knew what was coming next, and she was already preparing for it the same way she'd prepared for every combat deployment, by making sure her affairs were in order, her boundaries clear, and her choices absolutely her own. The coffee was bitter. She drank it anyway. The coffee was bitter. She drank it anyway. By 6 in the morning, Dr. Hargrove was making calls. His medical school roommate picked up on the 3rd ring, now a hospital board member in Dallas, owed Hargrove a favor from a messy malpractice settlement that never reached court. "I need documentation," Hargrove said, his voice smooth as a knife through silk. Nurse Cooper performed an unauthorized invasive cardiac procedure. Pericardiocentesis. No physician oversight. "I'm building a file." The board member listened. He understood institutional protection. By 6:45, Hargrove's wife's former boss, currently serving on Sacred Heart's credentialing committee, was receiving a similar call. "Pattern of insubordination," Hargrove explained. "I'm documenting everything." By 7:15, his golf partner, board treasurer Richard Stanton, had agreed to fast-track an external review. 3 calls. 3 favors. 3 walls closing in. Hargrove moved like a chess player who had already won but was still executing the endgame, methodical and without urgency. Ashley had no idea any of it was happening. She was in the break room at 7:43, restocking her locker with fresh gloves and gauze, when Patricia Vance from HR walked past without stopping. Something in that non-greeting made Ashley's neck tighten. She'd learned to read silences. Silence meant decisions had already been made. By 8 o'clock, Hargrove was on the phone with Ashley's nursing school at the University of Texas. He requested her references, specifically her clinical supervisors from her final practicum. "I'm conducting a credentialing review," he told them, his tone perfectly professional. "We've had some concerns about scope of practice compliance. I'm verifying her training history." He didn't mention the unauthorized procedure. He didn't need to. The implication was enough. Her supervisors, 3 women who'd graduated 20 years before, remembered Ashley as quiet and competent. But they also remembered something else, an employment gap that didn't quite match her timeline. She seemed overqualified for a nursing student, one of them said. Technically, yes, but her interpersonal skills needed development. Hargrove wrote that down. Interpersonal difficulties. Pattern forming. By 10 o'clock, an outside investigator named Dr. Marcus Brennan arrived at Sacred Heart in a dark sedan. He was expensive, the kind of consultant hospitals brought in when they wanted to turn someone into a liability. Brennan carried a leather folder and wore the expression of a man who had ended 100 careers before breakfast. He set up in a conference room on the 2nd floor and began requesting files. Every medication administration record Ashley had ever entered. Every note she'd written. Every incident report mentioning her name. The unauthorized procedure was there, documented by Hargrove himself. 0147 hours, Nurse Cooper performed emergency pericardiocentesis on SEAL patient without authorization. Patient outcome positive but procedure exceeded RN scope of practice. Recommend immediate credentialing review. What the note didn't mention was that the patient would have died in the time it took to call Hargrove. What the note didn't mention was that every medical professional in the ICU that night knew it was the correct call. Brennan didn't care about context. Context was the enemy of documentation. At 11 o'clock, Ashley was called to the administrative conference room. She knew, walking down that hallway, that something had shifted. The air felt different, charged with the particular static of institutional judgment. She walked with her shoulders straight, the way she'd been trained to walk under fire, the way that never showed fear. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in corpse light. Her badge felt heavier with each step. 5 people sat across a laminate table. Hargrove on the left, his expression carefully composed, a wolf in business casual. Patricia Vance from HR, taking notes. 2 board members Ashley didn't recognize. One was the medical school roommate from Dallas, in town specifically for this. And Dr. Marcus Brennan, the consultant, opening his folder with the sound of destiny closing a door. "Ms. Cooper," Hargrove began, "we're here to discuss several concerns regarding your clinical practice and professional conduct." He laid out the medication discrepancy from 3 weeks ago, the one that had already been explained away, the one that was wrong. But in Hargrove's presentation, it became not a single mistake but the first evidence of a pattern. Then the documentation issues. Then staff statements about her interpersonal difficulties. He saved the procedure for last. On October 17 at 0147 hours, you performed an emergency pericardiocentesis on our Navy SEAL patient without authorization from the attending physician. This is a critical care procedure that exceeds the RN scope of practice in Texas. It's a violation of hospital protocol and state regulations. His voice never raised. That was the terrifying part. Hargrove sounded like a man discussing the weather. Brennan shifted forward. "Ms. Cooper, what gave you the confidence to perform that procedure without supervision?" He asked it like he already knew the answer was arrogance. Ashley took one measured breath. She'd been in situations where the next words determined who lived and who died. This was smaller and somehow harder. Lieutenant Webb would have died waiting for authorization. The pericardial sac was compressing his heart. He had minutes. "I made the call." She said it in a voice that held no apology, no explanation, no expectation of forgiveness. Just fact, delivered like a situation report. "That's not your call to make," Hargrove said. The first edge of anger crept into his tone now, not loud, but present, like a shark's fin breaking the surface. Patricia Vance closed her notebook. The sound was final. "Ms. Cooper, effective immediately, Sacred Heart is placing you on administrative leave pending the outcome of this investigation. Your security badge is deactivated. You're not to enter the clinical areas. You are still subject to all confidentiality agreements. She slid a letter across the table. Ashley didn't need to read it. She already knew what it said. 30 days pending investigation. 60 days pending further review. 90 days and the word termination would appear. Hargrove had built this with the precision of a man who understood that the system protected people like him. Ashley stood. She picked up the letter. She didn't look at Hargrove, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing anything in her face except the mask of someone who had already survived worse. "Is there anything else?" she asked. Her voice had gone quiet, flatter, the voice of someone checking a box. "No," Patricia Vance said. "You can go home." She drove home with her deactivated badge on the passenger seat, the worn combat boot still locked in her trunk. The morning was grey, Houston's version of fall, muggy and colorless. Traffic moved like congealed blood through the arteries of the city. She thought about calling someone. She had no one to call. Her parents were dead. Her husband was dead. Her friends from the Navy had stopped reaching out years ago, understanding that she wanted to be forgotten. She drove past her apartment complex once, twice, 3 times before pulling in. The motion of the keys turning in her apartment door felt like marking time in a mausoleum. That weekend, it rained. Not the dramatic thunderstorm kind, but the relentless, exhausting kind that made you feel like the sky had given up and decided to just weep. Ashley drove to Greenlawn Cemetery on Saturday afternoon. She found the grave without needing directions. She'd been here enough times that her feet knew the way. Senior Chief Michael Cooper. Beloved husband. Died in a training accident 6 months after she'd left the Navy. A parachute that didn't deploy. One mistake and half a decade of marriage, gone. She knelt in front of the headstone, the rain soaking through her jeans, cold and inexorable as judgment. Her forehead touched the stone, it was wet and smooth and felt like nothing. Like the absence of everything. "I tried to disappear like you asked," she whispered to the rain, to the stone, to the space where he wasn't. Tried to be normal. To have a regular life. To not scare anyone with what I'd seen. Her voice cracked, just slightly, just enough that if anyone had been listening, they would have known something was broken. "I failed at that too." The rain hammered down. Around her, other headstones stood like soldiers in formation, everyone here proving the same thing, that time was a myth and the dead never really left. You just learned to live with ghosts in your chest. Monday morning, the call came at 6:30. Patricia Vance's voice, professional and empty. "Ms. Cooper, Sacred Heart is placing you on administrative leave, effective immediately. The investigation will proceed over the next 4 to 6 weeks. You'll be contacted with findings." The line went dead. Ashley hung up the phone. She walked to her bedroom and opened her closet. The scrubs hung there of 3 sets, pressed and waiting, ready for a shift that would never come. She pulled them down one at a time. Navy blue. Sacred Heart logo. The uniform of someone who thought she could rebuild a life in the margins, that she could be invisible enough, quiet enough, ordinary enough that the past wouldn't find her. That the person she used to be wouldn't reach up through the floorboards and pull the new life down into the dark. She folded each set carefully. The muscle memory was automatic, the way she'd folded uniforms 1,000 times before, the way her hands moved faster than her thoughts, the way fabric became geometry, became order, became something that felt like control. Outside, the rain had stopped, but everything still dripped. The world felt waterlogged, heavy, impossible. She stared at the folded scrubs and wondered if she had any life left to rebuild, or if Hargrove had finally succeeded in erasing the only identity she'd managed to construct in 3 years of silence. 1 week later, the phone rang at 7:14 a.m. Ashley was standing in her apartment kitchen, coffee untouched, staring at a box of belongings Sacred Heart had shipped home, her stethoscope, her badge, a greeting card from a shift nurse signed with a single initial. The voice on the other end was Janet Reeves, the ER director. "Ashley, I know everything's been complicated. But we have a trauma admission. Patients asking for you specifically. Says you saved his brother's life in Marjah. The cup slipped from her fingers. It hit the tile floor and shattered into 7 pieces. She counted them without meaning to. I'm suspended, Ashley said quietly. Not anymore. Your reinstatement paperwork cleared 20 minutes ago. The board met emergency session last night. There are people here who need to talk to you. But first, this patient. He's critical. Will you come? The drive to Sacred Heart took 14 minutes. Ashley sat in the parking lot for 3 more, her hands locked on the steering wheel, before she moved. The hospital doors slid open like they always had, but the air felt different, thinner, charged with the weight of something about to break. Her security badge worked. It beeped green. They had her in trauma bay too. A man in his mid-40s, dark eyes hollow with pain, chest wrapped in surgical dressings. His face went absolutely still when she entered. Senior Chief, he said in broken English, his voice fractured like old concrete. You saved my brother in Marjah. Let him live. You remember. It wasn't a question. Ashley's throat closed. She did remember. A supply convoy, August 2016, small arms fire from the Jolan district, a young fighter with a penetrating abdominal wound who'd been coughing blood while 3 corpsmen froze. She remembered her hands on him, the smell of copper and diesel fuel, the radio crackling with medevac ETA. She remembered his name, Rashid, and she remembered him living because she'd moved while everyone else waited for permission. I'm here, Ashley said. Her voice came out steady. We're going to take care of you. The next 3 hours, she didn't think about Hargrove. She didn't think about the suspension or the boot boxes or the phantom weight of a life that had been erased. She moved through his care the way she'd moved through everything for the past 3 years, competent, invisible, necessary. Fluid resuscitation protocol. Typo negative. Trauma labs. The attending surgeon thanked her twice. She nodded and didn't break eye contact. Then the hallway door opened and Lieutenant Webb walked through with a 12-year-old girl at his side. He looked stronger than he had 3 weeks ago. His daughter had his jaw and his mother's eyes, and she was holding a manila folder like it was made of titanium. Webb's face was doing something complicated, gratitude and sorrow and something harder underneath, like he was finally seeing her for the first time. Ashley, he said, and that was all he said, but the girl stepped forward. My dad told me you're a senior chief petty officer, the girl said. She had her father's directness. He told me what you did. He wanted you to know that the whole team knows. So we brought you this. The mission file. 3 pages. Marjah. Call sign designation. 8 operators listed by code name. 8 names next to 8 extraction dates, 8 names that had come home alive because someone had moved while the system waited. Ashley's hand started moving before her brain caught up, reaching for the folder, opening it, reading the operational stamp. Combat Medic Cooper, call sign Juice. 17 documented interventions. 17 lives. The numbers blurred. Not because her vision failed, but because something in her sternum was fracturing in a way that had nothing to do with bombs or bullets. My dad said you don't like talking about it, Webb's daughter said. But he said you have to know that we know. That you're not invisible anymore. The next voice came from the hallway threshold. That's correct, Emma. The team leader was tall, grey at the temples, his bearing the kind that made the air reorganize itself. He wore navy dress blues with insignia that meant he'd been doing this since before Webb was born. Behind him, 3 board members filed into the hallway. Ashley recognized Dr. Ellington, the board chair. She didn't recognize the JAG officer in the civilian suit, but she recognized the weight of his presence. I'm Captain Marcus Reeves, the team leader said. His voice was the color of gunmetal. Senior Chief Cooper served under my command in Afghanistan. I'm here to provide testimony regarding her operational record and her conduct. Dr. Ellington stepped forward. His face had the look of a man who'd just discovered he'd been playing poker with someone's house on the table. The board would like to hear that testimony now, Captain. if you're willing. What happened in the next 17 minutes didn't feel real until it was over. Captain Reeves spoke about the Bronze Star. Then the second Bronze Star. Then, and here his jaw tightened, the Navy Cross. Not a theory. Not a suspicion. A documented, board-approved decoration for extraordinary heroism under fire. 17 documented lives saved through medical intervention in forward combat zones. Combat medic training through NSW medical protocols. The kind of skill that took for years and a willingness to operate in conditions where the margin between life and death was measured in seconds and steady hands. He described watching her insert that chest tube. Combat medicine. NSW, a naval special warfare, level competence. And then he described something else, that he'd mentioned her expertise to Dr. Hargrove in the hallway 2 days before her suspension. His response, Captain Reeves said carefully, was to ask me to stop encouraging her to discuss her background. To quote him directly, it's disruptive to the unit dynamic. The silence was the kind that happened before things broke. Then Michael Chen stepped out of the elevator. Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm. IT Director for Sacred Heart. His face was set like concrete poured the day before. I accessed the security logs per Dr. Ellington's request, Chen said. His voice was flat, professional, the voice of someone delivering evidence that couldn't be misinterpreted. Dr. Hargrove accessed the server logs for the trauma bay at 3:38 a.m., the night of the SEAL patient's cardiac event. He attempted to delete 14 minutes of hallway footage, specifically the section showing Nurse Cooper's response time and the pericardiocentesis procedure. He held up a thumb drive. I preserved the footage per hospital protocol and reported the deletion attempt immediately. Every frame. Every second. The hallway was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system's steady exhale. Ellington's voice came out low. "Where is Dr. Hargrove?" "Waiting in the administrative conference room," Chen said. "He doesn't know about the preserved footage yet." What happened next didn't just silence the room. It ended a career. Ellington walked toward the conference room. The board members followed. Captain Reeves gestured for Ashley to wait in the hallway. But she could hear the confrontation start, Ellington's voice rising, Hargrove stammering denials, the slow collapse of a man who'd built his entire identity on controlling narratives and connections. The deletion attempt was evidence of consciousness of guilt. The false medication report was provable, pharmacy had the logs. The systematic isolation, documented by staff. The public humiliation, witnessed by 5 people, 3 of whom had written statements. 3 hours later, Hargrove's hospital privileges were suspended pending medical board investigation. Sacred Heart terminated his employment for cause. His carefully cultivated network scattered like it had been built on gelatin. The golf partners stopped calling. The medical school roommate sent a terse email. No hospital in Houston would touch him. By Friday, he was teaching CPR at Houston Community College for $18 an hour in a basement room that smelled like chlorine and regret. 6 months passed. Ashley moved through them like someone waking up from a long sleep. She accepted the clinical coordinator position at Sacred Heart. The cardiac unit staff treated her differently now, not with suspicion, but with the kind of careful respect you give to people who've actually lived what they talk about. Torres sent her a message, always new. Emma Webb called her twice to ask medical questions for a school project. Captain Reeves stopped by the hospital once, shook her hand, and said, "Welcome back, Senior Chief." Then came the envelope with the presidential seal. An invitation to the White House. A ceremony honoring combat medics. The Joint Chiefs were attending. The citation included her name, Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Marie Cooper, Navy Medical Corps, and her medals, listed in ascending order of significance like a series of heartbeats. She pulled her dress uniform from the back of the closet. The blues hung like a ghost made of wool and memory. She'd worn them exactly once, at Michael's funeral, 4 years ago. The ribbons were still aligned perfectly, she'd kept them that way, pressed them flat every 6 months like she was keeping a shrine. Navy Cross. First Bronze Star. Second Bronze Star. Purple heart. Purple heart again. The colors were small and tremendous. They meant everything that couldn't fit into a normal life. She dressed slowly. Shoes buffed to a mirror shine. Cover positioned exactly right. Hair pinned the way they'd taught her in 2012. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't see Ashley, the anonymous nurse. She saw Deuce. She saw the woman who'd held 17 people together when everything was coming apart. In her pocket, she placed a photograph. Michael, in his dress whites, that crooked smile that had made her believe in second chances. She carried him with her to the White House like a prayer. The worn combat boots remained in her trunk. At Sacred Heart, before she left for the airport, she stopped by the cardiac unit. The staff stood and applauded, actually stood, a full 5 seconds of silence and recognition. Torres saluted. Jen nodded with something that looked like approval. Emma Webb was there with her father, and she hugged Ashley tight without asking permission, the way kids do when they understand something older people forgot. That same afternoon, in a basement room at Houston Community College, a student asked Dr. Hargrove if he'd ever worked in a real hospital. He said he'd been cardiac director at Sacred Heart. The student Googled it on her phone during the break, found the articles about the Navy Cross recipient. The ones about who Hargrove had tried to destroy. She didn't come back after lunch. At the White House ceremony, Ashley stood in formation with 11 other combat medics. Photographers clustered like they had a limited supply of light. The president shook her hand, thanked her for her service. She stood absolutely still, letting the cameras capture her, thinking of the 3 years she'd spent trying to disappear. That night, back in Houston, she drove to the cemetery. Michael's headstone was quiet in the darkness, rain-washed and solid. She knelt beside it, touched the granite, and whispered something she'd never been able to say out loud. I tried to disappear like you asked. But maybe some of us aren't meant to. When she stood, her spine was straight. No hesitation. No apology. She walked back to her car, where the worn combat boots waited in the trunk, still too heavy to carry inside, but no longer a weight that could drown her. The car door closed soft and final, and she drove home into a life that finally knew her name. Because here's the thing about true heroes, they don't need the world to validate them. But when the world finally does, it should know exactly who it's been wrong about. And Dr. Hargrove, he spent years believing competence was about hierarchy, about who you knew, about controlling the narrative and crushing anyone who threatened the hierarchy. He never understood what Senior Chief Ashley Cooper learned in Marjah: true class is what you do when the lights go out. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed, please like this video and subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to remember that the quietest person in the room might be holding everything together. And in the comments, tell us, have you ever been proven right when someone said you were wrong? We want to hear your stories.